You're listening to Seattle Real Estate Podcast.
All right, folks. This morning I was watching a little Tim Pool. I know a lot of you guys are like, Tim Pool's he's just too get in it and kind of go for me. And I get that. There are times where he's a little intense for me too. But then I watch one of his skateboarding videos and I'm like, okay, that guy's pretty cool. He's just doing his thing. That's his style. I'm a little bit more laid back. I have a little bit of an older perspective, but he was doing the podcast that I'm doing today. And there was some really interesting stuff. And a bunch of you guys sent me links to basically the same news articles. We got a New York Times article and also LA Times, I think it is. We're going to read some of this stuff. Bottom line is violent crime is a real problem for defund the police activists. After the whole George Floyd thing, defund the police, abolish the police was a big thing. Now, we've had that happen in many police jurisdictions across the United States, and violent crime is up. Are the two correlated? Yes and no. That's what we're talking about today here in the Seattle Real Estate Podcast. If you're new here, my name is Sean Reynolds. I own a couple of real estate companies. And like I say, I read the news that reasonable people want to hear. All right. So if you're reasonable, stay tuned. If you're not reasonable, go watch something else. It's up to you. Do your thing. That's the kind of guy I am. Do your thing. All right. So I'm going to read two articles here. And the first one we're going to kind of bang out. And this is the one that Tim Pool did. Super interesting. This morning, editorial wrote about this situation in Minneapolis where a surge in violent crime has created a sudden reversal in how many people, including some activists, feel about police. Yesterday, the New York Times published a similar piece about Los Angeles, which we're going to read, which reveals the city defund the police efforts have effectively been reversed as local leaders realize they need more cops on the street. Shocking. And then it says, underlined with a hyperlink, not fewer. And that is what I have been saying. I mean, so much of what I read and talk about is just, reasonable people thinking reasonable thoughts. And then I get you guys saying, oh, Sean, you're going to get deplatformed. They're going to take you off. All right. So I got to really kind of hold the line at reasonable, right? I mean, this whole thing with the whole police deal, this is not a hard call. I'm not a cop. I've never been a cop. Never wanted to be a cop. That was never in my game plan. But sitting from the outside, I've been arrested a few times. How's that? And do I have awful, feelings about police? No, I was breaking the law. This is cause and effect. Can't tell you how many times I've been pulled over for like speeding or nickel dime stuff. I got pulled over one time for not having valid tabs in the car. Yeah, I bought them. And I put them in the glove box and forgot to put them on. And so I ran out there, put them on, and the cop was like, put your tabs on next time. He was right. I was driving around without tabs. So it's usually my fault when this kind of stuff happens, right? So the surge in violent crime is prompting cities whose leaders embraced the values of the movement last year to reassess, reimagine, rethink how far they are willing to go to reimagine public safety and divert money away from the police and towards social services. A year after streets echoed with calls to defund law enforcement, city leaders embraced the message by agreeing to take $150 million away from the Los Angeles Police Department, or about 8% of the department's budget. The city last week agreed to, here we go, increase the police budget to allow the department to hire about 250 officers. This storyline, we've been talking about this forever. Is this so hard to figure out? I don't think it is, right? I just don't think it is. Now, I do think that the rise in violent crime isn't directly correlated 100% with the number of police officers that we've lost. I don't think that is true. Again, I am not a criminologist. I think there are a number of factors working here. I think it's basically people are kind of pissed off and taking things into their own hands. And if they know there are some fewer cops out there and they know they're not going to get prosecuted, yeah, they're kind of doing some stuff, right? Let's keep going. The increase essentially restores the cuts that followed the protests. That's interesting. Of course, there are still activists who'd rather see the police defunded, but the zeitgeist has shifted. Support for Black Lives Matter is way down from where it was last summer. And with the violent crime up, there isn't much cover for progressives to demand police be defunded. I didn't think we'd be here. I thought we would have probably more time of police departments. And hey, police in Seattle, police in Portland, police in LA, they've been quitting in record numbers. I've had so many police send me their story of, okay, if you can read this anonymously, and I will read some, not today because we got a bunch to cover, but the stories are all the same. Hey, political leadership doesn't support police. Seattle, so bad. What is your problem, Seattle? I'm the Seattle Real Estate Podcast. I'm not supposed to say that kind of thing, but I do. The New York Times has made a real effort to avoid connecting the increase in violent crime to the BLM protests that followed George Floyd's death. This isn't the first time they've written about the topics without even mentioning it, but some criminologists have said the Ferguson effect is a possible explanation of the data. Okay, so we've got this storyline, and they've got graphs, and they've got... This guy finishes up this article with, I'll wrap up this comment left on the story. 26 people were shot in New York City over the weekend. There were multiple anti-Semitic attacks, people pushed onto subway tracks. Social workers aren't going to fix that. That's kind of what I've been saying is, all right, you got the big, scary 6'4" guy who's 245 pounds. He is not wearing a shirt. He is covered in human feces. He has a knife. And he is screaming stuff that does not make sense, and he's coming after you. Do you want to have the social worker sent out? Probably not. An unarmed social worker? Probably not. Social workers aren't going to fix that. Not in the short term, they're not. Stopping mob and gang violence is a job for the police. I gotta say... agreed on that one. Okay. I mean, that's just where I'm at is when the bad man comes, give me a cop. That's kind of where I'm at. I just want a policeman to do his thing. Okay. Policeman or woman. I don't want to be sexist, but growing up, you always hear policeman, and then you got to go down this whole other thing. And it's like reworking a trained thought on, in a brain that's already had too much information. Let's go with the LA Times. Helen Jones grew up in Watts in a time of gang wars and crack epidemic when the police used battering rams to knock down the walls of suspected drug houses and black people were routinely profiled or beaten by street cops. Watts, you hear guys talking in White Man Can't Jump. Wesley Snipes talking to Woody Harrelson about Watts. We're going uptown to Watts to play some basketball where they take their basketball seriously because they're good athletes. Then and now, her life has been shaped by violence. Last spring, after the city shut down to contain the coronavirus pandemic, her nephew was shot dead in his home. The year before, her brother was shot in the back on a South Los Angeles street and lived. And in 2009, her son died in a downtown jail, in what the authorities call a suicide, but she believes was a murder by sheriff's deputies. So 3 very close people in her life killed. Last year, Miss Jones' demands for fewer police officers and more investment in communities like hers became the demands of a movement. The sign at all the entrances to CHOP, which were just intersections with concrete barricades the Seattle Department of Transportation had conveniently dropped off for said protesters. They all said, defund the police by 50% now, invest in communities, and release all the protesters. Those are the 3 major demands, right? So Seattle was no different. Demands for fewer police officers and more investments in communities like her became the demands of a movement. They were. After the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis shook the country, inspired the largest mass demonstrations for civil rights in generations, and pushed police reform to the forefront of the national agenda. Now, a year after Mr. Floyd's death, Los Angeles and other American cities, I read about Portland all the time. Man, it is just target practice down there. Brutal. Just LA and other American cities face a surge in violent crime amid pandemic despair and a flood of new guns onto the streets. The surge is prompting cities whose leaders embraced the values of the movement last year to reassess how far they are willing to go to reimagine, we already read this, to reimagine public safety and divert money away from the police and toward social services. I don't care how bad it gets. No one wants more cops, Miss Jones said, 56. Okay, actually, that is not true. A very, very small segment of the population doesn't want more cops. Everybody else pretty much does. They're looking around going, holy crap, look at these crime statistics. They are going the wrong direction. We've got that arrow just steadily going up to the right or to the left, however you see it, but it ain't going down. So I don't care how bad it gets. No one wants more cops, Miss Jones 56 said last week as she met other activists outside a food hall in South Los Angeles. We don't need tougher police. We need more alternatives to help people thrive. Okay, I am of the thought that the alternatives, however they are good and they help out the bigger picture of what we're talking about here, they are probably not on the front line to be doing anything right now. You've got a crime epidemic happening on the streets of the United States right now. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? But more cops is what Los Angeles is getting. That's what you're going to do. You're going to get some more cops. A year after its streets echoed with calls to defund law enforcement and city leaders embraced the message by agreeing to take $150 million away from the LAPD, or about 8% of the department's budget, the city last week agreed to increase the police budget to allow the department to hire 250 officers. That's great and all. Can they even get 250 in there? Can they even do that? The numbers I've seen with Seattle, I'm like, all right, good luck getting anybody there. You want to go cover the South Central Los Angeles beat? I don't think so. You couldn't pay me enough. I'm pretty out there as far as some of this stuff goes. Being a cop in one of these cities, that's above my tolerance for putting my own life at risk, right? And I think a lot of police officers are in the same kind of, they're like, hell no, you don't pay me enough. The increase essentially restores the cuts that followed the protests. We are full circle in just over a year, right? Full circle. On the streets of South Los Angeles, where residents have historically suffered the most from aggressive policing and gang violence, and where much of the current surge in shootings is happening, officers are ramping up patrols and stopping more cars to look for guns. That's what's going on. All this is necessary, some leaders believe, because violent crime is up sharply. Last year's murders were up 36% in LA, and the city is awash in new guns. All right, so then we're going to have people going, it's the guns problem. They're killing everybody. We got to get rid of all those guns. That's not the thing. It's not the thing. It doesn't help, but that is not the essential thing going on here, right? We've lost more than a decade of progress, Chief Mitchell Moore of the LA Police Department said in an interview, referring to the significant drops in crime in the years before the pandemic. I won't argue there is substandard housing. Agreed. Education. Agreed. Broken families, substance abuse, the systems that are racist and have systemic issues that have gone on for generations, he said. He's saying, hey, and I've talked about this many times, I know that's out there too. When he said it's gone on for generations, he said, when asked about the demands of protesters, but the fix of that is not to eliminate policing. And that's been my whole thing is, hey, you want to work on some of this stuff? 2 thumbs up. I'm all for that. Get some more funding to the police department so you can let them know this behavior acceptable, this behavior not acceptable. But it's going to take more money, not less money. And unless you have a fix for it on the other end, all right, we're defunding the police. Here's what we're going to do. Unless you have a known fix that is going to work, you're going to have this stuff go on. And that's literally what's happening. And this has not been a difficult call to make, has it? Violent crime going up. Shocking. Those are some interesting statistics. I am shocked, said nobody, right? It's a trend mirrored across the country where crime is skyrocketing in many big cities. We're going to get into it here. Putting liberal leaders under pressure to balance the demands of activists against the concerns of some residents about rising violence. You know what I find super interesting? Is that mayors in all of these cities, they're like, okay, we're gonna try and give you activists the stuff that you want. We're gonna give you some property. All right, let's deed that property over. Yep, you get that one. Okay, so we've got a shortage and we've got fewer cops. We're gonna take some of that money. We're gonna Yep. We believe in the community-based programs, and I do too. I think those things work. But where they stop short, where these mayors consistently stop short, is defunding the police. They know that on their watch as mayor of these places, it's not going to be a pretty sight when you have fewer police officers than can keep a city safe. That's what's going on. And you see this consistently. Mayor so-and-so, who supports all this other stuff, but doesn't really support defunding the police, right? Our mayor here in Seattle, same thing. Yeah, don't cut the number of cops. That's not going to work out well. They never come out and say that, but that's the underlying message, right? I mean, you got to have police to cover your streets. Otherwise, they become unsafe, which is the argument some would say is happening right now. In New York, where homicides grew by nearly 45% last year. I'm sorry, excuse me, what? In New York, where homicides grew by nearly 45% last year, crime is dominating the discussion in the race for mayor. Last week in Philadelphia, where crime is up sharply, Democratic primary voters overwhelmingly backed the city's progressive district attorney despite opposition from police unions. Even smaller cities haven't been spared the rise in violence. Louisville last year set a record for homicides with 173, and this year is on pace to surpass that. Criminologists and law enforcement leaders largely blame the rise in violence on two things: historic increase in gun buying by Americans, but the people that are doing all this shooting, they already had guns. All right. You're never going to get guns out of the hands of the bad guys. You're just not. And that's just an argument. I don't think. So you got a historic increase in gun buying by Americans with a flood of illegal so-called ghost guns, often assembled with parts bought online and are untraceable, and the despair and economic devastation of the pandemic. That is, I think, the underlying issue is people are they're out of control. They don't have a lot to live for, and they're just going to take matters into their own hands, and they're going to go shoot the guy dissing them. That is what's happening. Still, while the number of murders in Los Angeles last year, 350, was the highest in more than a decade, it was nowhere near the number of killings in the early 1990s. That was the Rodney King era, right? Where more than 1,000 people were killed in a year. And other crime, I mean, that was horrific to watch. Horrific. And other crimes such as rape and burglary are down so far this year compared with numbers from last year. Okay, so it's basically, it's violent gun violence for, I don't know, is that even a term? I think it is. And even as the politics shifts a year after the unrest, activists and the ordinary citizens who joined them on the streets can claim a number of wins. Los Angeles officials diverted $150 million from the police budget last year to study alternatives to traditional policing. All right. So we got $150 million to reimagine and rethink. And there is some of that I hammer on that a lot, don't I? But there is some of that needs to go on. You got to figure out ways. Okay, you can't do that as a police officer. You know, here's what we're doing. You got to be reasonable here. You can't do this stuff that's just shockingly horrible. All right. But the vast majority of cops, they're not doing that. They're just not. You have how many instances of this coming up? All right. You got some. No doubt about it. Historically, has this been a thing? Absolutely. Does it go on today? Absolutely. But getting rid of cops, that's the train wreck that you don't want to watch happen. Voters also elected a new district attorney who promised to prosecute officers and send fewer people to prison, and approved a measure to spend millions of dollars a year on alternatives to incarceration and more social services. All right, well, we'll see how that goes. In some liberal cities like Minneapolis, where gun violence is surging and where the police department is depleted after so many officers quit or retired, some elected officials and older clergy members and civil rights leaders are echoing the sentiments of conservative commentators. What? Let's read that again. Elected leaders and older clergy members, old people, they've got a little perspective, and civil rights leaders are echoing the sentiments of conservative commentators who claim a link between the violence and the movement to defund police departments, saying officers are demoralized and pulling back on patrolling high crime areas. So my whole thing has been, you defund the police, you're going to impact the BIPOC community the most. Right? I mean, how many times have I said that? I don't know. Probably a lot. And it's not because I'm a real estate guy. Don't take anything, 100% that I say. I'm giving you my opinion. But this is not a hard call to make. I don't think so. Am I way out of line here? I mean, I don't really think so. And all the stories that are adding up, Portland, you guys are just off the charts shooting each other. In Los Angeles, Chief Moore said that officers were not disengaging, pointing to sharp increases this year in gun and gang-related arrests because there's so much crap going on. But that emotionally they are beat up and they feel like they're being vilified and victimized for the wrongful criminal acts of a few. Okay, totally. 100%. Yep. Stop and frisk in a car. Activists worry the rise in gun violence has already become a roadblock to reimagining public safety as Los Angeles leaders backtrack from their vows to radically change policing. This year, the city's police department deployed an elite unit to South Los Angeles to carry out what critics have long said has led to racial inequities and sometimes fatal shootings, random vehicle stops in pursuit of guns and suspected gang members. It is stop and frisk in a car, Marquise Harris Dawson, who represents South Central Los Angeles on the city council. They take an area. They decide that this area has a lot of shooting back and forth. They stop everybody. They look in the car for guns. That's what they're doing. The vehicle stops, Mr. Harris Dawson said, are pretextual, meaning officers look for minor vehicle infractions like having tinted windows or a busted taillight as a pretext to pull somebody over. The strategy may be legal, but it is controversial in minority communities and is a tactic that has led to violent encounters between officers and citizens, including the recent police killing of Daunte Wright in the Minneapolis suburb of Brooklyn Center. Here in Seattle, was that a Washington? I think that was a Seattle thing. They're looking at literally getting rid of all of these minor vehicle infractions, just telling the police, don't pull anybody over on those. Because, we've had a few incidences where cops have gotten killed or people have gotten killed. So don't pull anybody over. That's a proposal that's out there that to me is nuts because it means, we've got these traffic laws on the books and it's so people drive in a way that doesn't impact others. We live in a law. We have a society. We have rules. Demands that cities replace police officers with unarmed civilians and technologies like cameras to enforce traffic violations have been at the center of reform efforts because many fatal encounters between officers and citizens, especially black men, begin with the traffic stop. But it's not the traffic stop. It's the gun in the car, shooting somebody else, threatening, something goes sideways, somebody whips out a gun, people get killed. That's the deal, right? Traffic stop, nobody gets killed. Just the traffic stop alone. You hand somebody a ticket, they go on their merry way. There's always something going on. Chief Moore said the vehicle stops were necessary right now because there are so many guns on the streets. But he emphasized that other strategies, such as working with gang interventionists, were a higher priority. And we've got that going on in Seattle. Just you guys, community groups trying to work at that grassroots level, doing their thing. I'm all for that, but don't do that at the expense of taking the guys on the street who are actually trained how to handle this stuff on a daily basis, guys and gals. And he said the numbers of stops had relatively been low, 538 so far this year in South Los Angeles, compared with more than 3,700 during the same period in 2019. Last year, the number of vehicle stops were minimal, he said, partly because of the pandemic, and they just weren't really doing that. All right. As a black man growing up in South Los Angeles, Mr. Harris Dawson said he was routinely pulled over by the police and that didn't even stop even as he rose to power in city politics. One night last year after attending a Lakers game, he was pulled over in his neighborhood, he said, because the police were suspicious of his government license plate. The expectation was like this. Why is there a government plate in this area? Someone must have made off with a government car, he said. Mr. Harris Dawson said that rather than being a pretext for more policing, the rise in crime should intensify efforts only at reform. I think it actually increases the urgency of the reimagining, he said. Mr. Harris Dawson, who has supported a plan to stand up unarmed units to respond to mental health crises modeled on a program in Oregon, in Oregon and sponsored a study to remove the police from routine traffic stops. I don't know. I don't see that working out well, because what reimagining policing says, okay, if there are people shooting each other and there are people having mental health crises, what one should the police be doing right now? They should do both. Whole thing's a mess, right? 1992 and now, that's our next section here. In the decades since Miss Jones grew up in the violent streets of Watts, overall crime has plummeted, and relations between police officers and Black and brown communities of South Los Angeles have improved, propelled by reforms introduced in the aftermath of the police beating of Rodney King. Can't we all just get along, right? And the riots of 92 that provoked. That was just crazy to watch. Last year, as protests started across the country, it was common to hear leaders in Los Angeles say that the nation was now going through what the city went through in the 1990s, after not just the King beating, but also a corruption scandal known as Rampart and the O.J. Simpson trial, which exposed deep racism within the city's police department. Many people who began working on these issues almost 30 years ago are still in the field. There's a stark generational divide now. The younger Black Lives Matter-inspired activists often speak the language of abolition and defund rather than partnering with the police. From the crucible of 1992, former gang members in South Los Angeles worked to make peace, often working alongside a new force of police officers dedicated to community policing, in which officers worked in specific neighborhoods to establish close relationship with residents. Leon Giletti, who was drawn to activism after 1992, now works for Community Build, which was co-founded by Maxine Waters, a local congresswoman. Mr. Giletti's specialty is working to achieve truces between rival gangs. Unlike the younger activists with Black Lives Matter, he says working with the police is essential. We can't operate without the police. So I wouldn't say defund the police, Mr. Giletti said. Chief Moore said that 77% of the city's gun-related homicides these days were gang-related. 77%. So Mr. Giletti remains busier than ever, but the pandemic has curtailed his work. One of the most important aspects of gang intervention is to go to hospitals to meet victims of gang shootings and gather information to prevent retaliation. With hospitals off limits because of the coronavirus, Mr. Giletti has had to rely on phone conversations between family members and doctors. So he's basically got his hands tied, and he's a guy that's been through it. He's an older generation guy, and he's like, yeah, defunding the police, probably not so much. Last month, speaking from the Griffith Observatory, the panorama of the city laid out before him, Mayor Eric Garcetti, in his annual State of the City address, noted the rise in homicides and said, if you want to abolish the police, you're talking to the wrong mayor. Hard stuff. Interesting, though, isn't it? Because last summer, they were really on board with the whole activists and that kind of thing, and now things are changing. His proposal to increase the police budget has angered activists, but everyone has had one shared hope, that as the pandemic recedes and parks and schools reopen and gang interventionists can get back to work, the crime numbers will go back down. That would create new space for activists to push for deeper changes in policing. If the old crop of activists sought changes by partnering with the police, the defining view of the new movement is a focus on money and trying to pull as many dollars as possible away from police budgets and towards other programs that address systemic racism. The Reverend Najuma Smith Pollard, who works at the University of Southern California, training pastors in community organizing, said, we have to continue to push the issue on the budget because the budget is a moral document. Okay, but if you have fewer cops on the streets as a result of the budget, how is that going to work out in the near short term? I would say, in my humble opinion, as a real estate guy, not well. Miss Jones, who works as an organizer for Dignity and Power Now, is in the movement for the long haul, driven by her son's death in the custody of sheriff's deputies, for which she has won a $2 million civil settlement and is pushing for criminal charges. Above all, aside from policy wins and losses, she feels that the last year in America has at least shifted the debate. So bottom line is, big city like Los Angeles, rising crime rates, they are hiring more police officers. We'll just have to see how that goes, because contact that I've had with police officers that have been retired or recently retiring or thinking about retiring has been, hey, good luck with hiring anybody. And I've read story after story after story on why nobody wants to become a police officer. And it's just not that hard to figure out, right? I mean, they just had to basically take it at all the protests last year, and a lot of cities didn't have their backs, and they're putting their life on the line. And, quite frankly, they just don't want to do it anymore. So, if people want to defund the police and if people want to abolish the police, that's kind of what is happening. I've even read articles from the Seattle Times saying, it's these cops walking out. They're just kind of abandoning the city. And it's like, that's not the thing. These people like being police officers, but they don't want to, it's not worth risking their lives anymore. And I think we're going to find out what it looks like when you've got fewer cops on the street than it takes to keep a city safe. And there will be an uproar, because if it's happening in LA already, it's going to happen in other cities. It's going to happen in Portland. It's going to happen in Seattle, where there's enough pressure put on things. We're like, we need some more cops on the streets. This is not a hard call. You'll see this. And for me, I'll keep talking about it, because I think you can have a reasonable approach to this. You can have both sides covered. It's just that last summer's stuff, activism, really went hardcore one way. Now we're feeling the impacts the other way. And it's like, rising gun violence, not good. Got to deal with that. We don't want to have our fellow human being shooting our fellow human being, do we? That's not where we want to be. Okay. I will keep covering it for you here, though, right on the Seattle Real Estate Podcast. And why are we talking about this stuff on a real estate podcast? Because it's about community. And the homes, they don't really matter. I mean, I wish I could tell you, we only sell the finest and greatest homes here at Seattle Summit Properties Northwest. But it's about community. It's about people. That's what essentially makes up real estate. If you got people shooting each other, it's not a good thing. You want to go the other way, which we were doing. But now we're at a position where we're like, okay, got to make some changes. What are those changes going to be? That's the storyline we're going to cover here on the Seattle Real Estate Podcast. Thanks so much for being here. Love to have you subscribe. Love to have you hit that like button for this video. Love to have you hit the notification bell. We drop 2 podcasts a day, Monday through Friday, 1 on Saturday and Sunday. Thanks again for being here. I'll catch up with you guys soon. Until then, stay safe. We'll talk soon. Bye for now. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you'll know when our next video is out.